All right, guys, here's part 2 of lesson number 6. And so part 2, we're doing the exact same thing. We're going through that 5-step method that helps us systematically make sure that we check for every single rule. So as we talked about before, it's best to just kind of number them up top. So I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And this is just going to help me make sure that I check every single rule. So again, when we go to check, the first rule that we check for is the zero exponent rule. So I look for any zero exponents. Well, in example C, I don't have any zero exponents, so I don't need to do that rule. So I'm just going to put a little X right here just to say, hey, I checked for it, make sure that I did it, and I did, and there wasn't a zero exponent. So then we move on to rules number 2, which is those 3 different power rules. Now, a reminder, to find our power rules, we need to have parentheses with an exponent outside of it, which we do. We have parentheses with an exponent outside of it. Now, the entire fraction is in parentheses, and that's important to remember because that means it's the power of a quotient rule. But with the power of a quotient rule, what that means is we're going to multiply this -3 times every exponent on both the top and the bottom of the fraction. So we need to make sure that all of our parts of our term have an exponent on both the top and the bottom. So inside parentheses, I'm going to check. Well, my z doesn't have a listed exponent, so I need to do that. So that has an exponent of 1. Y has a listed exponent of -2. X has a listed exponent of 5 on the top, so that I've now got the top done. Then on the bottom, I see y has a listed exponent of -3. X does not have a listed exponent, so I need to check that and make sure that I get one, which is 1, x to the first power. Now, once I've got all of that figured out, now I can do the multiplication. So the first thing I'm going to do is multiply my x term on the top, the exponent of it, I should say. And so x to the 5th, well, 5 times -3 is x to the -15. 5 times -3 is -15. Then I need to do the y. So I've got y to the -2. Well, y, -2 times -3 is +6. Then I need to do my z term on top. So z to the first power, well, 1 times -3 is -3. Now I need to do the bottom of my fraction. So I'm going to do the bottom here. So when I distribute on the bottom, I get my x term, and my x has a exponent of 1. So x to the 1 times -3 is -3. And then my y term has a exponent of -3, so y to the -3 times -3 is +9. So now I've completed my power rules. There's no more parentheses left. I don't have any numbers with exponents on this one, so I don't have anything to simplify there. So we move on to the 3rd step, which is negative exponents. So now I'm going to look for any negative exponents. Well, I see I have a -15 exponent here, and its base is x. So I'm going to circle that because I know that it needs to move. Then I also on the top have a -3 exponent, and its base is z. So I'm going to circle that because I know it needs to move. On the bottom, I have a negative exponent of 3 here, and its base is x, so it needs to move as well. Well, just a reminder, when we're moving them, that means that they are going to the opposite side of the fraction, and when we move them to the opposite side of the fraction, that doesn't change the base, it just changes the exponent to a positive version of itself. So what you may notice is that the y's did not have negative exponents, so they are going to stay exactly as they are, where they are. So y to the 6th over y to the 9th. Now when I make my movements, my x to the -15 is going to go to the bottom and become x to the +15. My z to the -3 is going to go to the bottom and become z to the +3 exponent. And then my x to the -3 on the bottom is going to go to the top and become x to the +3. So very good, we've gotten rid of all our negative exponents. So now we can move on to step 4, which is product of powers rule. This says, hey, do you have the same bases on the same side of the fraction? So I'm going to look at the top and say, do I have the same bases? No, I don't. I'm going to look at the bottom and say, hey, do I have the same bases? No, I don't. So I do not have this rule going on. So I'm just going to put an X to show that I checked for it. So then the last rule that we check for, fifth rule, is the quotient of powers rule. Now remember, this means we're looking for the same base on both the top and bottom of the fraction. Well, I see that I have X's on both the top and bottom. So I am going to need to subtract their exponents, and the answer is going to go on the side with the bigger exponent to begin with. Well, the bigger exponent was on the bottom, that's x to the 15th, and then 15 minus 3 is 12, so x to the 12th. I also see I have like bases of y to the 6th on the top and y to the 9th on the bottom, so I'm going to subtract those exponents as well. The answer is going to go on the side with the bigger exponent to begin with. So the y's are going to end up on the bottom as well. And 9 minus 6 is 3, so y to the 3rd. Now the z's do not have a like base on the top, so they're going to stay where they're at on z to the 3rd. Well, you may be saying, well, now everything I have is on the bottom, so what's left on the top? Well, if you remember, all right, when we have variables, there's always a coefficient out in front of it, even if we don't see it, right? And that coefficient is always the number 1. So we really have a 1 out in front here, which means that we have a 1 left at the top. So our final answer here is 1 over x to the 12th, y to the 3rd, z to the 3rd. All right, so I'd encourage you to try example D on your own, then check your answer with mine. So example D says x to the negative 3, y to the negative 5th, w to the 0, over x to the negative 1, y to the negative 5th, in parentheses, all of that to the negative 2 power. So first rule we check for, 0 exponent rule. Do we have it? We do, and the base is w. Well, because there's all those other things on top, I'm going to just cancel that out, and we're just left with the other stuff, because anything times 1 is itself, and anything to the 0 power is 1. So I've done the first rule, then I'm looking for the second rule, our power of powers rules, right? Or power of product or power of quotient. So indicator again is parentheses with an exponent outside of it. Well, on the top of my fraction, I don't have that, but I do see parentheses with an exponent outside of it on the bottom. So I'm going to need to do that rule. So the top is not going to change. It's going to stay as x to the negative 3, y to the negative 5, over. Then I need to make sure before I do this that all my parts of my term have their own exponent inside. Well, y has its own exponent of negative 5 and x has its own exponent of negative 1, so I can do this. So I need to go ahead and multiply the negative 2 times the negative 1 of the x, so that becomes x to the negative 1 times negative 2 is 2. And then I need to do the y, so negative 2 times negative 5 becomes y to the positive 10. So then once I've done that, now I'm on to the third rule. Because I've gotten rid of parentheses, there's no numbers with exponents on them, so I don't need to simplify that. So I need to move to the third rule, which is negative exponents. Do I have any of those? Well, I see on the top that I have a negative 3, and its base is x. And on the bottom, on the other part of the top, I have a negative 5 with a y base. So both of those are now going to go to the bottom to get rid of the negative exponent and make it positive. Having all types of trouble with my lead breaking. So when I do that, all right, that means that on the bottom, my x squared is going to stay where it's at, and my y to the 10th is going to stay where it's at. Now the top, the x to the negative 3 is going to go to the bottom and become x to the positive 3, and on the y to the negative 5 is also going to go to the bottom and become y to the 5th. Now you may say, well, what's left on top? Well, this is the same idea as example C. When we move everything off the top, we still have our coefficient of 1 up here. So we're going to put a 1 right there. So then after we've done that, right, then we move on to the fourth rule, which is product of powers. Now product of powers, for that to be taking place, we have to have the same base on the same side of the fraction. Well, the top only has a 1, so we don't have to worry about it there. So we're really just looking at the bottom. Do I have the same base? Well, I see that I have two x's listed, so I'm going to combine those. So I know that I've got this rule, so I got 1 over. Well, when we are combining them, right, we're saying x to the third times x squared. Well, we add the exponents, so that becomes x to the fifth. And then on the other one, I have y's, so I'm going to combine those as well. So I add those exponents, and that becomes y to the 15th, because 10 plus 5 is 15. So then last rule we check for is our quotient of powers rule, which says, hey, do we have the same bases on opposite sides of the fraction? Well, because I only have a number 1 on the top, that means I can't have the same base on the top and the bottom. So we don't even have this rule. So that means that my final answer is 1 over x to the 5th, y to the 15th. All right, so let's take a look at our final example here of example E. Now this one can kind of trick people up a little bit because we've got two parts to it. We've got this multiplication symbol that is separating kind of two parts of this exponential expression. Now how we do this is really no different than what we did before. We're going to go through our 5 steps and check each rule. All right. Now we may need to do some consolidating at some point, and if that happens, we'll show you how to do that. But go through your rules first before you decide about doing any of that. So my first rule that I need to look at is zero exponent rule. So do I have any zero exponents? Well, I see that I have a zero exponent right here, and its base is this entire parenthesis. So anything to the zero exponent just becomes 1. So that means this entire thing is 1. Well, 1 times 5x to the negative 2, y to the negative 5th, w to the 9th. Well, anything times 1 is itself. So really, this whole thing just goes away. And all we're left with at this point is this part right here. So that's why I say make sure do each rule first, then go on to the next one, because we lost half of it because of the zero exponent rule. Turning everything into 1 and then multiplying by 1 doesn't change that second half. So then I'm going to go on to step 2, which is my power rule. So do I have any parentheses with an exponent outside of it? I don't. There's no parentheses left with exponent outside of it, so I don't even have this rule. So I'm not going to do that rule or rewrite it. I'm just going to leave it as it is. And then I'm going to go on to the third rule. Now, third rule says negative exponent rule. So do I have any negative exponents left in here? Well, I see that I have a negative exponent of negative 2, and its base is the x. So I need to get rid of that one, or change it, I should say, not get rid of it. I also see I have a negative exponent of negative 5, and its base is y. Well, if we remember correctly, the way we get rid of these is by moving them to the opposite side of the fraction. Well, you may be saying, well, there's no fraction listed. Well, a reminder, if we don't have a fraction listed, that's kind of like a whole number. So if we had the number 2 was all we had, the other side of the fraction would be over 1. Same idea here. We're going to put this all over 1, which then allows us to take this to the bottom and this to the bottom. So my top, I'm still going to have my 5 up there. My w to the 9th is still going to be on the top because they didn't have negative exponents, so they stay where they're at. On the bottom, though, I'm now going to have 1, but I don't have to write that because I'm going to have other things. So my x to the negative 2 is going to come to the bottom and become x squared. My y to the negative 5 is going to come to the bottom and become y to the 5th. So now I've gotten rid of all my negative exponents. So then I need to check for the fourth rule, which is product of powers rule. So again, for this to be going on, we need to have the same base on the same side of the fraction. So when I look at the top, I don't have any like bases, so not going on there. On the bottom, also don't have any like bases, so nothing going on there. So I don't have any of this going on. So then fifth rule we check for is quotient of powers rule. Well, quotient of powers rule says we have to have the same base on both the top and the bottom. Now again, we always start with the coefficients here. My coefficient on the top is 5. There's not one listed on the bottom, which means it's 1. And we're looking for a factor greater than 1. Well, that can't be possible if you have 1, so nothing to do there to simplify coefficients. So now I'm looking for the same base on the top and bottom with the letters, the variables. Well, I see on the top that I have w to the 9th, but no w on the bottom. On the bottom, I have x, but no x on the top, y on the bottom, but no y on the top. So this rule's not taking place either. So that means that my final answer on this one is 5 w to the 9th over x squared y to the 5th. All right, well, if you have any additional questions on these exponential rules and using them in combination when we've got multiple rules, please feel free to reach out. Otherwise, you should have what you need to complete worksheet number 2 of chapter 5.